One very important change that I think can happen is that we not assume in research or policy that children are always traumatized. I mean, young people, they don't know that the situations they're growing up in are not normal. I mean, they may be painful and there may cause some trauma, but what we're finding out with a developmental approach is that they interact with the situations they're in. They try to figure out what's going on. They find the resources that are available, and they still try to create spaces to play and to interact with other people. So I think one of the most important things is to not assume trauma, because that puts kids in an ongoing spiral of trauma. They can reproduce the discourse of trauma. So not to assume that. I'm calling that sort of a focus on oppressive history rather than living history. And children are trying to figure out what's going on around them. So certainly not assuming trauma, and then trying to provide spaces that would be as normative as possible. Play spaces, social spaces, and the assumption that the children can learn and they don't have to overcome trauma before they can be normal children and use language and use social interactions and learning as a way to still have a developing childhood when these conflict situations may last. Certainly the average is 7 years from the build-up to the resolution, but could be much longer. So really letting them have a childhood and creating spaces and supports for childhood. That's what we're finding, that kids use those skills in these situations if we don't assume trauma for 100% of the response. What we're doing, for example, in Colombia, South America, with colleagues I have there who are dealing with children displaced by the conflict there, is to have them create stories for younger children, however young they are, for younger children, explaining what's going on and how they might cope with it. And in that context, they take some control, some emotional and cognitive control over what's happening. They use narrative, for example, to figure it out, and then they maintain connections with their cohort, with any of the older people that are still around and not affected and in very damaged ways by the conflict, and with the younger generation. So I think informal policies that of the kinds that community organizations are doing, humanitarian aid organizations are doing, but they should be supported, especially when larger institutions like formal education may be suspended. So informal education in camps or even in smaller units that can support children's ongoing development and not always expose them to what might be seen as therapy, which assumes they're damaged.